The biting wind stripped the final autumn leaves from the Wyoming pines as Claire Whitmore stood before a locked door that had once been hers. Betrayal, she discovered, tastes like ash when you're left with $84 a dying Subaru and a thermometer that refuses to stop dropping. The brass locks gleamed with newness, mocking the key in her trembling hand, a key that had opened this door every day for 12 years until 3 hours ago. Through the frosted glass of the front entrance, she could see Daniel Brennan, her husband of 12 years, standing in the foyer she had helped design. Beside him loomed Harrison Cross, a corporate attorney whose reputation for burying opposing parties in endless litigation preceded him through every courtroom in Teton County. Daniel wouldn't even step outside. He stood there, arms crossed, watching her through the glass like she was a stranger begging at his gate. Harrison had handed her the eviction notice through a crack in the doorway, his manicured fingers retracting the moment the paper left his grasp, as if poverty might be contagious. The legal maneuvering was brilliant in its cruelty. For the past decade, Claire had poured her inheritance and her wages as an architectural drafter into Daniel's logistics company, Brennan Freight and Supply. She had trusted him with a faith so complete it bordered on foolishness. That trust had led her to sign documents she believed were routine tax filings, never questioning, never doubting, never imagining that each signature was another nail in her own coffin. The Delaware Shell Corporation had swallowed everything. The house, the business, even the modest savings account she thought was jointly held, all of it vanished into a legal structure she hadn't known existed until Harrison Cross explained it to her through that narrow gap in the doorway. When Daniel's affair with Amber Fletcher, a 29-year-old supply chain manager, came to light 3 weeks ago, Claire had demanded a divorce. She'd been prepared for heartbreak, for anger, for the messy unraveling of a marriage. She hadn't been prepared for this. Daniel's response had been a preemptive strike executed with military precision. He froze their joint accounts while she was in Denver, sitting vigil at her mother's hospital bedside. He filed the eviction notice with the county clerk on the same day her mother died. He had her belongings packed by professional movers and deposited on the driveway in cheap cardboard boxes already warping from morning frost before she'd even returned from the funeral. Claire had come back a week early, unable to bear the empty hospital room where her mother had taken her final breath. She'd driven through the night exhausted and hollow, expecting at least the comfort of familiar walls. Instead, she found the locks changed and her life sorted into boxes like discarded inventory. She stood shivering in a thin denim jacket that had been adequate for October in Denver, but was laughably insufficient for Wyoming's high country. Her checking account held exactly $84. The 1998 Subaru Outback behind her burned oil faster than gasoline, leaving a blue-gray cloud in its wake that announced mechanical failure to anyone within 100 yards. The Wyoming winter was already sharpening its teeth. In less than a month, meteorologists promised the region would be entombed in snow, with temperatures routinely plunging to 20 degrees below zero. Homelessness in Jackson Hole during November wasn't just a hardship. It was a death sentence delivered by nature's indifferent hand. Claire loaded the cardboard boxes into the back of the groaning Subaru, her hands numb despite the work gloves she'd found at the bottom of one container. A quiet, terrifying clarity began to take hold in her chest, displacing the shock that had insulated her for the past hour. She had no family left to lean on. Her mother, the last connection to a past that felt increasingly like someone else's life, had been cremated 3 days ago. The ashes sat in a simple urn on the passenger seat, still in the funeral home's plastic bag. Her friends, or the people she'd thought were friends, had been Daniel's friends first. Couples they'd hosted for dinner parties, colleagues from the logistics company, neighbors in this exclusive development who'd smiled and waved for years. Every single one had stopped returning her calls the moment word of the divorce spread. She understood now that their loyalty had never been to her. It had been to proximity, to success, to Daniel's rising business, to the social capital of association. As she turned the key in the ignition, listening to the engine sputter and cough before finally catching, she realized she had exactly one asset left in the world: a seemingly worthless 5-acre plot of land off Highway 191 near the remote outskirts of Pinedale, nearly 2 hours southeast of Jackson Hole. The property had been bequeathed to her by her grandfather, Arthur Whitmore, in a handwritten will that had barely survived probate challenges from distant cousins who'd expected something more valuable. Arthur had been a reclusive man, a retired geologist who'd bought the land in 1978 with vague intentions of prospecting for minerals he never quite specified. He'd paid cash according to the county records Claire had reviewed once out of curiosity. Daniel had spent years demanding she sell it, calling it a useless pile of dirt and limestone that generated nothing but property tax bills. She kept it out of pure sentimentality, a connection to the grandfather who taught her to read topographical maps when she was 7 years old. Now it was her only sanctuary. The drive southeast to Pinedale took nearly 2 hours each mile, carrying her further from the manicured wealth of Jackson Hole and deeper into Wyoming's raw, unforgiving heart. The landscape shifted with brutal honesty. Opulent ranches with painted fences gave way to sagebrush expanses that stretched toward horizons broken only by jagged rock formations. Dense stands of dark timber clung to hillsides like survivors of some ancient catastrophe. By the time she pulled the Subaru off the main highway and onto the rutted, overgrown dirt path leading to Arthur's land, the sun was dipping below the horizon. The sky burned in violent shades of bruised purple and dark orange colors that promised cold and cared nothing for human comfort. Claire stepped out of the car into wind that howled with a different voice than the valley breezes of Jackson Hole. This wind came screaming across open plains and slammed into the foothills of the Wind River Range with raw, unbridled ferocity. She walked the perimeter of her property boots, crunching on frost-hardened earth breath, pluming in clouds that dispersed instantly in the gale. The land was aggressively sloped, culminating in a steep embankment of exposed limestone and clay that backed into a thick stand of ancient lodgepole pines. Surveying it with an architect's trained eye, Claire understood immediately that building a traditional cabin was impossible. A timber frame required money machinery and time-3 resources she possessed in absolute zero quantities. A canvas tent would be shredded by this wind within a week. She would freeze to death long before December arrived, another tragic statistic in Wyoming's brutal winter mortality reports. Standing there as darkness gathered and temperature plummeted, Claire stared at the high embankment, tracing the natural contours of rock and soil with growing understanding. Her background in architectural drafting suddenly merged with the desperate instinct for survival that was beginning to override everything else. The Earth maintains a constant temperature once you get deep enough. Below the frost line, the ground stays a relatively stable 50 degrees Fahrenheit, insulated from the violent temperature swings of the surface. Pioneers had dug sod houses and root cellars to survive prairie winters. Animals burrowed into hillsides to escape the freeze. The principle was simple, ancient, and proven by millennia of adaptation. Claire wasn't going to build a house on the mountain. She was going to build a home inside it. That night she slept in the back of her Subaru, bundled beneath every blanket and piece of clothing she owned, shivering violently as the temperature dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The metal frame of the car conducted cold like it was designed for the purpose. Every time she managed to drift towards sleep, muscle cramps would jolt her awake, her body protesting the impossible task of maintaining core temperature in these conditions. She woke before dawn with a stiff neck, aching joints, and a fierce burning resolve that had crystallized during the sleepless hours. This was no longer just about survival. It was about proving Daniel Harrison Cross and the entire world that had discarded her completely wrong. She would not become a tragic statistic of the Wyoming winter. She would become the mountain itself. The next morning, Claire drove into the sleepy town of Pinedale, population barely 4,000 souls clinging to existence in Sublette County's unforgiving landscape. At Miller's Hardware and Supply, a weathered storefront that looked like it hadn't changed since 1960, she spent $70 of her remaining 84. She purchased a forged steel mattock, a square-nosed spade, a heavy-duty tarp, and a pair of thick leather work gloves. The items felt impossibly heavy in her arms, tools meant for laborers with calloused hands and strong backs. The cashier, a kindly older man whose name tag read Thomas Griggs, eyed her thin frame and the heavy tools with concern that creased his weathered face. His eyes, pale blue and sharp despite his age, took in details she suspected he'd spent a lifetime learning to read. Fixing to do some late-season trenching. The question came gently without judgment, but with genuine curiosity. Claire met his gaze and offered a tight, polite smile that revealed nothing. Something like that. She didn't want to explain that she was about to excavate a dwelling by hand, that she had no other options, that this was desperation disguised as a plan. Thomas nodded slowly, sliding $14 in change across the worn counter with fingers that showed decades of hard work. Ground's getting mighty hard out there. First serious freeze hit 2 nights ago. He paused, studying her face with an expression she couldn't quite read. Recognition flickered in his eyes. "You're Arthur Whitmore's granddaughter, aren't you? Saw you at his funeral, must be 6 years back now." Claire nodded, surprised that anyone in this small town would remember. "He was a good man, your grandfather. Quiet fellow. Used to come in here regular, buying surveying equipment, geology tools, sometimes just rope and tarps. Always paid cash. Never talked much about what he was working on out there." Thomas rang up the purchase with careful deliberation, each movement precise. He knew that land of his pretty well, I'd wager. Spent 30 years poking around it. The comment settled into Claire's mind with weight she didn't yet understand. She thanked him, gathered her purchases, and drove back to the property with a hollow feeling in her stomach that had nothing to do with the fact that she'd skipped breakfast. Returning to Arthur's land, Claire selected her site with the methodical analysis her architectural training had instilled. She chose a section of the embankment that faced south, positioned to catch the low winter sun during the brief hours of daylight. Dense old-growth pines formed a natural barricade to the north and west, blocking the prevailing winds that had howled through the night. The geological composition appeared to be a mix of hard-packed glacial till clay and fractured limestone, structurally sound, meaning it wouldn't easily collapse, but it would be absolute misery to dig through. She swung the heavy mattock for the first time at 9 in the morning. The iron hedge struck the earth with a dull, jarring thud that sent a shockwave up her arms and rattled her teeth. The impact chipped away perhaps a handful of dirt and small rocks. Claire stood there, breathing hard from that single swing, and calculated the mathematics of impossibility. One swing, thousands more to go. Thousands upon thousands, each one fighting frozen earth that had no interest in yielding. For the first 4 days, the work became a grueling, agonizing blur that consumed every daylight hour. Claire dug from sunrise to sunset, her body screaming in protest at demands it had never been asked to meet. Blisters formed on her palms, despite the leather gloves swelled with fluid, tore open and hardened into thick, bloody calluses that cracked and bled with each new swing. Her muscles, unaccustomed to such brutal physical labor, cramped violently during the freezing nights, waking her with pains so intense she bit through her lip to keep from crying out. She lived on cheap peanut butter, eaten straight from the jar, instant coffee made over a small camping stove that sputtered in the wind in sheer unadulterated spite. The spite burned hotter than any campfire, fueled by memory of Daniel's face through that frosted glass, by Harrison Cross's manicured fingers, releasing the eviction notice, by every friend who had stopped answering her calls. By the end of the first week, she had carved a rough opening into the hillside. An entryway 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, extending approximately 5 feet into the embankment. It was little more than a shallow cave, barely worthy of the name, but the moment she stepped inside for the first time, she noticed the difference. The biting wind vanished completely. The air was remarkably still and noticeably warmer than the bitter chill outside, though calling it warm would be generous. But a simple hole in the dirt was inherently dangerous. If the ceiling gave way, she would be buried alive, suffocated under tons of earth and rock, with no one to hear her die. Claire shifted her focus from pure excavation to engineering. Drawing on knowledge from her architectural training, and vague memories of her grandfather discussing load-bearing structures. She hiked into the surrounding Bureau of Land Management territory, federal land that stretched for miles in every direction, and scavenged fallen lodgepole pines. The dead trees, victims of beetle infestations that had ravaged Wyoming forests for decades, lay scattered like broken giants. She dragged them back to her site one by one, their weight enormous, the distance feeling infinite. Her shoulders developed deep bruises from the makeshift rope harness she'd fashioned. Using a rusty handsaw she'd found in the Subaru spare tire compartment, a tool Arthur must have left there years ago, she cut the logs to size. Each cut took an hour of sawing that left her arms trembling. She created sturdy support pillars and horizontal crossbeams, wedging them into place to shore up the earthen ceiling. The work was slow, meticulous, and absolutely critical. She became a scavenger in ways that would have horrified the woman who'd lived in Jackson Hole just 2 weeks ago. 2 miles down the highway sat an illegal dumping ground, a scattered wasteland of refuse where locals had been depositing unwanted items for decades despite county ordinances. Claire spent her evenings picking through the rusted detritus of other people's lives, searching for anything useful. She found a dozen discarded cinder blocks, several sheets of warped corrugated tin roofing, and half a roll of heavy-duty waterproof construction membrane that someone had abandoned mid-project. She hauled these treasures back to her cave with the reverence of a pirate hoarding gold, each item representing possibility, representing survival. The weather was turning rapidly. By mid-November, the first serious snow flurries began to dance in the gray sky, delicate at first, then increasingly aggressive. The temperature at night was dropping below 10 degrees. Claire could feel winter closing in like a predator circling wounded prey. She accelerated her pace, fueled by terrifying urgency that made her hands shake even when she wasn't swinging the mattock. Then on the seventh evening, as Claire was digging deeper to expand a storage alcove, disaster nearly struck. She was using the mattock to loosen compacted clay when she heard a sound that stopped her heart, a deep, ominous crack from somewhere above her head. Before she could move, a section of the ceiling sagged, dropping 6 inches in an instant. Dirt trickled onto her hair, her shoulders a gentle rain that promised catastrophic collapse. Claire froze, mattock still raised, every muscle locked in terror. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes barely breathing, waiting to see if the ceiling would complete its collapse and bury her alive. The dirt continued to trickle, a quiet whisper of impending death. Very slowly, moving with excruciating care, she backed toward the entrance, each step placed with surgical precision. She made it outside and collapsed on the frozen ground, shaking so violently her teeth chattered. The near miss had been a brutal lesson delivered by the mountain itself. She couldn't rush this. Speed would kill her just as surely as the cold. She needed to dig smarter, not faster, and she needed to understand the engineering principles that would keep her alive. That night, sleeping in the Subaru again because the cave felt too dangerous, Claire remembered something her grandfather had said to her when she was 12 years old. They'd been examining a road cut on Highway 26, Arthur pointing out the layers of sediment like pages in a geological book. His voice had been quiet, almost reverent, as he'd traced the limestone layers with one weathered finger. The earth will tell you its secrets if you learn to listen. Measure twice, dig once. The limestone remembers everything. At the time, she thought it was just the rambling of an old man obsessed with rocks. Now exhausted and terrified, she understood it as wisdom born from decades of careful observation. The next morning, Claire began shoring operations in earnest. She measured the ceiling height, calculated approximate load weights based on soil density, and positioned her scavenged logs with careful precision. She cut support pillars that would bear weight vertically, then created horizontal cross beams to distribute pressure across multiple points. The work was tedious, exhausting, and absolutely necessary. While digging foundation holes for the support pillars, her spade struck something metallic about 8 inches below the surface. The unexpected resistance sent a jolt through her tired arms. Claire knelt and carefully excavated around the object with her hands pulling away cold dirt to reveal a small, waterproof surveyor's case, the kind used to protect sensitive instruments and documents in the field. The case was old but intact, sealed with a latch that had corroded but still functioned. Claire pried it open with fingers that trembled from more than just cold. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept moisture at bay for decades, she found a leather-bound field notebook. The cover was embossed with initials A. Arthur Whitmore. She opened it carefully, mindful of pages that had become brittle with age. The entries were dated from 1986 and 1987, written in her grandfather's precise, almost architectural handwriting. Most were technical notations about soil composition, depth measurements, and geological observations that meant little to her. But the final entry, dated March 1987, made her breath catch. Limestone aquifer confirmed. High-capacity vein intersects property southeast quadrant. Estimated flow rate exceeds initial projections. Substantial commercial potential. Don't tell Catherine yet. Need independent verification before raising hopes. Catherine had been her grandmother dead for 15 years now. Arthur had never told her about the water because he died 6 months after writing that entry, lung cancer claiming him, before he could complete whatever verification he had planned. Claire sat in the dirt holding her grandfather's notebook and felt the pieces of an invisible puzzle beginning to align in her mind. Daniel had been pressuring her to sell this land for years. He'd called it worthless, useless, a burden. But what if he'd known something she hadn't? What if he'd commissioned his own geological survey, discovered what Arthur had found, and then systematically destroyed her life to steal it? The thought was too monstrous to fully process in that moment. Sitting in the cold with darkness gathering, Claire carefully returned the notebook to its case and carried it into the cave, placing it in the driest corner she could find. Evidence, proof, insurance. Over the next week, she continued building proper structural support while expanding the cave. She created a living chamber approximately 12 feet deep and 10 feet wide, with a smaller storage alcove branching off to one side. The total interior space reached roughly 180 square feet, tiny by conventional standards, but palatial compared to sleeping in the Subaru. The excavated dirt she piled strategically outside, creating a windbreak that would help insulate the entrance. She built a retaining wall using the scavenged cinder blocks and packed earth, leaving a narrow doorway. She hung the heavy tarp over the opening to seal out the drafts, securing it with rocks and rope. The physical toll was extraordinary. Claire lost weight. She couldn't afford to lose her clothes hanging loose on a frame that was becoming whipcord lean from relentless labor and inadequate nutrition. Her hands were now masses of hardened calluses and half-healed cuts. Her back ached with a deep, bone-level pain that never fully subsided. But the cave was taking shape, transforming from a desperate hole in the ground into something that might actually preserve her life through the coming winter. The real breakthrough came when she tackled the heating problem. A cave without warmth was just a tomb that took longer to claim you. But an open fire without proper ventilation was a carbon monoxide death trap. Claire needed a heating system that would provide warmth without poisoning her, using only materials she could scavenge or afford with the $14 she had left. She spent an entire day researching in the Pinedale Public Library, using their internet connection to study historical survival techniques. She discovered the Dakota fire hole, a method developed by Native Americans and perfected by pioneers, a system that created efficient heat while remaining nearly invisible from a distance and using minimal fuel. The design was elegant in its simplicity: 2 holes, a primary pit for the fire itself, and a secondary angled tunnel connecting to the base of the fire pit to feed it oxygen. The secondary tunnel created a draft that pulled in cold air from outside, feeding it under the fire and creating a hotter, more efficient burn. For exhaust, she would need a vertical vent that could carry smoke away without creating dangerous buildup. Claire spent 6 brutal hours digging the fire pit system, her hands cramping around the tools, her back screaming with each shovelful of earth removed. She excavated the primary pit near the entrance of the cave where smoke could more easily escape. Then she dug the secondary tunnel at a precise angle using techniques her grandfather's notebook had described for other purposes, but which she adapted to this need. For the exhaust system, she returned to the illegal dump and spent 2 hours searching until she found what she needed, a length of rusted iron pipe approximately 8 feet long and 4 inches in diameter. Someone had discarded it years ago and weather had pitted the surface, but it was structurally sound. She hauled it back in 3 trips, unable to carry the full weight in one journey. The cave's limestone ceiling had a natural fissure running through it, a crack that extended up through the earthen layers above. Claire positioned her fire pit directly beneath this fissure, then drove the iron pipe up through it using rocks and wedges to hold it in place. She sealed the gaps around the pipe with wet clay she'd excavated from deeper in the cave, packing it tight. The clay would bake hard once the fire was lit, creating an airtight seal. When she struck the first match to dry lodgepole pine kindling, Claire held her breath. The smoke wavered, uncertain, dancing in the still air of the cave. Then the draft from the secondary tunnel caught, pulling oxygen into the base of the fire. The flames grew stronger, hotter, and the smoke began to rise. It climbed the iron pipe in a steady column, drawn upward by the temperature differential and the chimney effect. Within minutes, the smoke was drafting perfectly, exiting through the pipe, while the secondary tunnel fed the fire with a continuous supply of cold air. The transformation was immediate and profound. The clay walls of the cave began to absorb the radiant heat, warming slowly but steadily. Claire stood there watching her engineering actually work and felt something close to triumph cut through the exhaustion. By Friday, November 23rd, the world outside began its transformation into something that would kill her without adequate shelter. The meteorological reports on the radio had been growing increasingly dire for days. A polar vortex was breaking free from the Arctic, colliding with an atmospheric river of moisture from the Pacific. The combination would create what forecasters were calling a once-in-a-generation storm system. The blizzard was predicted to strike on November 27th, dumping 3 feet of snow across Sublette County, with wind gusts exceeding 70 miles per hour and temperatures plunging to 30 degrees below zero. Every local news station was issuing emergency warnings. Shelters in Pinedale were opening early. Residents were being urged to stock supplies and prepare for multi-day power outages. Claire had 4 days to finish making her cave survivable. She accelerated her final preparations with the focused intensity of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. She scavenged more firewood, dragging dead lodgepole pines from the surrounding forest until she had a stockpile of 40 logs each, cut to approximate 2-foot lengths. She tested her water collection system using the tarp to channel melted snow into containers she'd scavenged from the dump. She sealed every gap and crack in the cave entrance with additional clay and strips of the construction membrane. For the door itself, she sacrificed her Subaru. Using a pocket knife, she slashed the upholstery from the back seats, pulling out sheets of dense foam insulation that the manufacturer had installed for comfort, but which would now serve a grimmer purpose. She packed this foam between the corrugated tin sheets and the cinder block retaining wall, creating layers of insulation. She fashioned a crude but functional door from scavenged plywood, attaching it with hinges she'd unscrewed from the Subaru center console. She sealed the edges with rubber strips cut from the floor mats, creating a barrier against wind that could force its way through even the smallest gap. On Tuesday afternoon, November 19th, gray and bitterly cold, Claire was inside the cave using a hand trowel to smooth the clay walls when she heard the unmistakable crunch of heavy tires on her gravel access path. The sound sent a spike of adrenaline through her system, instant and primal. Very few people knew about this property. Fewer still would have reason to visit. She peered through a gap in the tarp that still covered part of the entrance. A sleek black Range Rover had parked next to her battered Subaru, the contrast between the vehicles almost obscene. 2 men stepped out, both wearing expensive insulated designer coats that probably cost more than Claire had earned in a month at her old job. One of them was Daniel Brennan. The other was an older man she didn't recognize, carrying a leather folio in one manicured hand. Claire felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to let them search and leave to avoid confrontation. But this was her land, her property, and she had spent 2 weeks transforming herself into something harder than the woman Daniel had discarded. She stepped out from behind the tarp, wiping clay-stained hands on her jeans, and faced them. Daniel's eyes swept over the scene with an expression that managed to combine shock, disgust, and cruel amusement. He took in the dirt piles, the scavenged logs, the dark opening in the hillside, and her appearance, gaunt, filthy, transformed into something he clearly didn't recognize. A smile spread across his face, the kind of smile predators wear when they've cornered wounded prey. His voice carried across the cold air with casual cruelty. The words cut deeper than wind. "I heard rumors you hadn't left the county. I didn't realize you'd reverted to the Stone Age. Living in a mud hole, Claire." Claire stood her ground, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the hammering of her heart. Each word came out cold, precise, a blade wrapped in silk. "You're trespassing, Daniel." He laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement, as if her claim to this land was a joke they both understood. He gestured to the older man beside him with careless authority. "Actually, we're here to do you a favor. This is David Kensington. He represents a commercial water rights consortium. Turns out this useless patch of rocks you've been camping on sits directly over an underground aquifer they need to tap for the new highway expansion project." David Kensington stepped forward with the careful movements of someone accustomed to delicate negotiations. His smile was practiced, patronizing, the expression of a man who made his living, convincing desperate people to accept unfavorable terms. His tone was measured, reasonable, the voice of someone offering charity rather than exploitation. "Miss Whitmore, your ex-husband informed us of your current living situation. We understand you're experiencing severe financial difficulties. The consortium I represent is willing to offer you a flat $10,000 for the deed to this property. I assure you it is more than fair market value for undeveloped, non-arable land in this location." Claire stood there, pieces clicking into place in her mind with terrible clarity. The geological survey Arthur had conducted, the commercial aquifer he'd discovered, but never lived to exploit. Daniel's years of pressure to sell this supposedly worthless land. The timing of the divorce, the calculated destruction of her finances, the eviction that had left her with nothing. He had known. He had known about the water all along. The realization washed over her like ice water, clarifying everything. Daniel had likely commissioned his own geological survey during the divorce proceedings, discovered what her grandfather had found decades ago, and then systematically destroyed her life so she would be desperate enough to sell for a fraction of its value. The consortium would pay millions for water rights. He was offering her 10,000, counting on her desperation to blind her to the theft. Her voice, when it emerged, was barely above a whisper, but carried an edge that made both men shift uncomfortably. "My grandfather was a geologist, Daniel. I guess he knew what was under this land, and I guess you thought you could freeze me out to steal it." Daniel's smile faltered, replaced by something harder. He had expected gratitude, surrender, not comprehension. His voice took on a sharper edge, the mask of false concern slipping. "Claire, be reasonable. $10,000. That's enough to get a decent apartment in Pinedale, maybe even Lander. You could start over, get a real job, stop living like some kind of feral animal. Look at yourself." She looked at him, instead really looked at him, and saw clearly for the first time what 12 years of marriage had slowly obscured. Daniel Brennan was a man who measured everything in terms of acquisition and advantage, who saw people as assets to be leveraged or obstacles to be removed. She had loved him once, had trusted him completely, and that trust had been the weapon he'd used to destroy her. She saw now how gradually he had isolated her, how systematically he had undermined her connections outside their relationship, how carefully he had positioned himself to control every aspect of their shared life. She remembered late-night phone calls he'd taken in other rooms, business trips to Las Vegas that always seemed to extend unexpectedly, the tension that appeared whenever she asked about company finances. The signs had been there all along. She had simply chosen not to see them. Claire turned and walked deliberately to where her mattock leaned against the cave entrance. She picked it up, not in threat but in statement, holding it loosely but purposefully in her right hand. The weight of it, the steel head that had broken frozen earth for 2 weeks, felt solid and real in a way that Daniel's promises had never been. Her voice came out steady now, each word a nail driven home. Get off my property before I call the sheriff and have you both arrested for trespassing. David Kensington looked nervously at the heavy iron tool, then back at Daniel, clearly uncomfortable with how the negotiation had deteriorated. His voice carried the uncertainty of a man who'd lost control of a situation he had expected to be simple. Perhaps we should give her some time to consider the offer. We can follow up next week. Daniel cut him off, his own voice sharp with anger barely contained. He had driven 2 hours for this expected capitulation and received defiance instead. His words came out like a threat wrapped in false concern. You're making a mistake, Claire. There's a blizzard coming down from Canada this weekend. The forecasters are predicting 3 feet of snow and sub-zero temperatures. Historic storm. You'll freeze to death in that hole, and then the county will auction the land off to pay your back taxes anyway. We'll get it either way. Claire met his eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but absolute. I'll see you in hell first, Daniel. She watched them drive away, the Range Rover's taillights disappearing into the gathering dusk, expensive suspension smoothing out the rutted path her Subaru had barely managed. The encounter hadn't broken her. Instead, it had ignited something in her chest, a raging fire fueled by vindication and fury. She had been right. About the land, about Daniel's motives, about everything. As the first heavy wet flakes of the incoming blizzard began to stick to her eyelashes, Claire turned back to her cave. She had a door to build, insulation to install, and she was rapidly running out of time. The mountain was about to test her in ways that would make the past 2 weeks seem like preparation. But she would not yield. Not to the cold, not to Daniel, not to anything. Claire spent the next 48 hours in a state of controlled frenzy, every movement calculated against the approaching deadline nature had set. The blizzard would arrive Friday evening, and meteorologists were now calling it a potential atmospheric catastrophe, the kind of storm that would be referenced in weather records for decades. She had less than 2 days to transform her cave from a shelter into a fortress capable of sustaining human life through conditions that would kill exposed flesh in under 10 minutes. The door construction consumed most of Wednesday. She worked with the corrugated tin sheets, first cutting them with a hacksaw blade to fit the dimensions of her entrance. The metal was brittle from years in the dump, and twice it cracked along lines she hadn't anticipated, forcing her to overlap pieces and seal the gaps with additional material. She positioned the tin against the cinder block, retaining wall, then packed the foam insulation she'd salvaged from the Subaru between the layers, creating a barrier that would trap air and slow heat transfer. The engineering challenge was sealing edges where cold could infiltrate. Claire used every scrap of material she could find: rubber strips from the floor mats, fragments of weather stripping she'd pulled from the Subaru's door frames, even old rags stuffed with clay and allowed to dry into rigid seals. She fashioned the actual door from 2 layers of scavenged plywood, sandwiching more foam between them, then mounted it using the hinges from the center console. The result was crude, ugly, and absolutely functional. By Wednesday evening, she had a door that could swing closed and latch from the inside, creating a seal tight enough that she could feel the air pressure change when she pulled it shut. She tested it repeatedly, swinging it open and closed, checking for gaps, reinforcing weak points with additional materials. The difference in temperature between inside and outside was already significant. The cave held at 48 degrees while the exterior temperature had dropped to 6 degrees Fahrenheit. Thursday brought a different kind of urgency. The sky had turned a peculiar shade of gray that reminded Claire of old bruises, and the wind had shifted direction, now coming from the north, with a steady pressure that spoke of massive systems in motion. She focused on stockpiling everything she would need to survive in isolation for potentially a week or more. Firewood became her obsession. She dragged dead lodgepole pines from the surrounding forest until her shoulders felt dislocated from the harness ropes. Each tree had to be cut into manageable lengths, then carried or dragged back to the cave entrance. By Thursday afternoon, she had accumulated a pile of logs that stretched 6 feet high and 10 feet long, enough fuel for perhaps 10 days if she burned conservatively. Water would be her other critical resource. Claire set up a collection system using the large tarp, positioning it at an angle outside the cave entrance, with rocks holding down the edges. When snow began to fall, it would accumulate on the tarp and she could bring it inside to melt over the fire. She also filled every container she'd scavenged from the dump: old coffee cans, plastic jugs, even a dented metal bucket with snow. She compacted as tightly as possible. Food was the weakest link in her survival chain. She had 1 jar of peanut butter, a box of crackers, 3 cans of soup she'd found abandoned at the dump, and a bag of instant coffee. Perhaps 4 days of calories if she rationed severely. She would have to supplement with pine needle tea for vitamin C and simply accept that hunger would be a constant companion. Thursday evening, as the last light faded from a sky that now looked like lead, Claire made a final inspection of her preparations. She walked the perimeter of the cave one last time, checking the structural support she'd installed, examining the clay seals around the ventilation pipe, testing the door hinges. Everything was as ready as her limited resources and desperate circumstances allowed. She stepped inside, pulled the plywood door closed behind her, and latched it. The silence that descended was absolute and profound. Outside, the wind was beginning to rise, a low moan that would soon become a howl. Inside, the only sound was the gentle crackle of her fire and her own breathing. The earthen walls blocked sound with the same efficiency they blocked wind, creating a bubble of stillness in the gathering chaos. Claire fed several logs into the fire pit, watching the flames climb and dance. The Dakota firehole design was working perfectly. The secondary tunnel pulled cold air from outside, feeding it under the fire to create an intense, efficient burn. The smoke rose through the iron pipe without hesitation, drafted by the temperature differential. Within an hour, the interior temperature had climbed to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough that she could remove her jacket. She sat cross-legged on a bed of pine boughs she'd laid across the earthen floor, wrapped in her sleeping bag, and allowed herself a moment to acknowledge what she had accomplished. 2 weeks ago, she had been standing outside a locked mansion with $84 and no future. Now she had built a dwelling with her own hands that might actually keep her alive through the worst storm Wyoming had seen in decades. The vindication was savage and complete. Daniel had left her to die. Instead, she had become something neither of them had imagined possible. Friday arrived with an oppressive stillness that made Claire's skin crawl. She woke early, climbed it out of her sleeping bag, and carefully opened the door to check conditions outside. The air was absolutely motionless cold, beyond anything she'd yet experienced, and the sky had turned a uniform gray that seemed to press down like a physical weight. The birds had vanished. Even the wind had stopped, as if nature itself was holding its breath. She spent the morning making final adjustments to her shelter. She reinforced the door seals with additional clay. She brought the last of her firewood inside, stacking it in the storage alcove where it would stay dry. She melted snow to fill her water containers completely. By noon, she had done everything possible to prepare. The blizzard struck at 6:17 Friday evening with a violence that defied her expectations. Claire was inside the cave tending the fire when she heard the first gust hit. It didn't build gradually, it simply arrived like a freight train that had been running at full speed but invisible until that moment. The sound was a physical assault, a roar so deep and continuous that it seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. She climbed to her feet and carefully opened the door a crack to witness what was happening outside. The world had disappeared. Visibility extended perhaps 3 feet before everything dissolved into a churning, white chaos. Snow wasn't falling. It was flying horizontally, driven by winds that had to be 70 miles per hour or more. The cold that forced its way through the narrow gap in the door was so intense it burned exposed skin. Claire quickly pulled the door shut and latched it, her heart pounding. Outside was death in its purest, most elemental form. Inside was warmth, stillness, and the soft glow of firelight on clay walls. The contrast was so extreme it felt surreal. Over the next 72 hours, Claire existed in a strange temporal suspension where time seemed to lose meaning. The blizzard raged without pause, a continuous assault that never varied in intensity. The roar penetrated even the earthen walls of her shelter, a constant presence that made sleep difficult despite her exhaustion. She found herself checking the door, compulsively convinced that somehow the wind would find a way through, that the seals would fail, that the cold would creep in and claim her. But the engineering held. The temperature inside the cave remained steady, between 52 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained by the Earth's constant temperature and the radiant heat from her carefully managed fire. She burned 2 logs every 8 hours, feeding them slowly to maximize efficiency. The Dakota fire hole consumed fuel with remarkable economy, converting wood to heat without waste. She melted snow for drinking water, boiled it to kill any potential contaminants, then stored it in containers arranged near the cave walls where the coolness would keep it fresh. She rationed her food with strict discipline, 1 small meal at midday, 1 in the evening, nothing more. Hunger became a familiar companion gnawing at her constantly, but she was alive. The isolation was profound in ways she hadn't anticipated. With no clock and no view of the outside world, she lost track of time completely. She slept when exhaustion overwhelmed her, woke when her body decided it was done resting, tended the fire-melted snow, ate sparingly and thought. The thinking was the dangerous part. Alone in the silence between the wind's roars, Claire's mind turned over the events that had led her to this moment. She examined her marriage to Daniel with the brutal clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. She had been complicit in her own destruction. She understood that now. She had trusted when she should have verified. She had signed documents without reading them thoroughly, believing that marriage meant shared interests and mutual protection. She had poured her inheritance and her wages into his company because he'd convinced her they were building something together. The lessons carved themselves into her consciousness like inscriptions in stone. Trust, she understood now, was a currency that had to be earned and verified, not given freely. Love without verification was simply another word for vulnerability. And vulnerability in a world where people like Daniel existed was indistinguishable from suicide. On what she believed was the 3rd night of the storm, though she couldn't be certain, Claire was sitting by the fire when she felt something strange. A rhythmic vibration transmitted through the compacted earth floor, too regular to be wind, too heavy to be small debris. She froze, listening with every sense heightened by isolation and hypervigilance. The vibration came again. A deep, resonant thud followed by what sounded like metal tearing, the shriek of steel under stress. The sound was muffled by distance and earth, but it was agonizingly close, somewhere near the steep switchback on Highway 191 that bordered the lower edge of her property. Claire sat perfectly still, weighing options. Opening the door in these conditions was insane. Stepping outside into the blizzard was suicide. She had no obligation to investigate, no responsibility to whatever had made that sound. The rational choice was to stay inside, tend her fire, and let whatever was happening outside resolve itself without her intervention. But the sound had been violent and final, the unmistakable signature of a vehicle crash. And she knew with terrible certainty exactly which highway that sound had come from. She stood slowly, pulled on every layer of clothing she owned, bound a scarf tightly over her face, and found the nylon tow rope she'd kept coiled near the entrance. She tied one end around her waist with a bowline knot, then secured the other end to the sturdiest log pillar inside the cave, creating a lifeline that could guide her back if visibility went to 0. The rope gave her perhaps 50 yards of range. If the crash was further than that, she wouldn't be able to reach it. And if she got turned around in the whiteout, the rope would be the only thing preventing her from wandering into the wilderness to freeze. Claire pulled the door open and stepped into hell. The cold was a physical assault slamming into her with force that stole her breath. The wind hit 70 miles per hour, maybe more, driving snow horizontally with enough force to sting exposed skin even through the scarf. The world had ceased to exist beyond a sphere of churning white, perhaps 5 feet in diameter. Visibility was functionally zero. She bent with enough force to sting exposed skin even through the scarf. The world had ceased to exist beyond a sphere of churning white, perhaps 5 feet in diameter. Visibility was functionally zero. She bent forward into the wind and began moving downslope, following the natural terrain, letting gravity guide her toward where the highway had to be. Each step was a battle against wind that wanted to knock her sideways. The snow was waist-deep in places, thigh-deep in others, packed and wind-crusted in unpredictable patterns. Her progress was measured in yards per minute. The rope paid out behind her as she moved, a thin lifeline connecting her to safety. She counted steps obsessively, knowing she had perhaps 200 steps before the rope ran out. 90 steps down the slope, the wind suddenly shifted, and she caught a scent of something that didn't belong. Petroleum antifreeze, the chemical signature of automotive fluids. 20 more steps, and a dark shape materialized in the swirling chaos. It was a black Range Rover, and Claire's heart seized in her chest as recognition slammed home. The vehicle had skidded off the iced-over highway, plowed through a guardrail that now hung in twisted pieces, and buried its front end completely in a massive snowbank. The engine was silent and dead. Hazard lights blinked weakly beneath accumulating snow already half buried. She waded closer, fighting wind that seemed determined to force her back. Reaching the driver's side door, she used her gloved hand to clear snow from the window and peered inside. The airbags had deployed, white fabric now deflating against the steering wheel. Slumped against that wheel, shivering so violently that his entire body seemed to convulse, was Daniel Brennan. His expensive cashmere coat was stiff with ice, his face a horrifying shade of waxy translucent blue that signaled advanced hypothermia. His eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow and irregular. In the passenger seat, clutching a designer handbag to her chest like a talisman, was Amber Fletcher. She was younger than Claire had imagined, perhaps 29, with blonde hair plastered against her scalp by melted snow that had leaked through the damaged windshield. She was weeping silently, tears freezing on her cheeks as they fell, her lips moving in what might have been prayer. Claire stood in the blizzard rope taut behind her and felt the weight of absolute power settle on her shoulders. She could turn around right now, follow the rope back to warmth and safety, let the mountain dispense its brutal, efficient justice. No one would ever know. The storm would bury the Range Rover completely, and when it was found in spring, it would be just another tragic statistic of winter's indifference. Daniel, the man who had stolen her life, who had orchestrated her destruction with calculated malice, who had left her to freeze while he tried to profit from her desperation, he was going to die in the next hour unless she intervened. Amber, the woman who had destroyed Claire's marriage, who had likely known exactly what Daniel was doing and chosen to participate anyway, would die beside him. The choice was hers alone: life or death, justice or mercy, survival or principle. Claire grabbed the frozen door handle, braced her boots against the chassis, and pulled with every ounce of strength her exhausted body possessed. The door was partially frozen shut, ice having formed around the seals. She pulled harder, muscles screaming, until the door suddenly gave way with an agonizing shriek of stressed metal and breaking ice. Daniel practically fell out into the waist-deep snow, his eyes open, partially unfocused, and glassy pupils dilated. His mouth moved, trying to form words, but only a weak rasp emerged. Claire reached in, grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive, useless coat, and hauled him upright. Her voice came out hard, stripped of everything except command, born from 2 weeks of surviving what he had intended to kill her. "Get up, now." She dragged Amber out next, a younger woman, completely unresponsive, paralyzed by cold and terror. Amber's designer boots, elegant things meant for city sidewalks, slipped uselessly in the deep snow. Her coat, fashionable and expensive, had no insulation worth mentioning. Claire positioned herself between them, grabbed the rope with one hand, and shoved Daniel forward with the other. Hold on to the rope. Step exactly where I step. If you stop moving for even 10 seconds, your heart will stop beating. Do you understand? Daniel nodded weakly, his coordination clearly impaired by the cold. Amber simply stumbled forward when Claire pushed her, moving like an automaton. The trek back up the slope was an ordeal that tested the absolute limits of Claire's endurance. The return journey, fighting uphill against wind while supporting two people who could barely walk, took nearly 40 minutes that felt like hours. The rope was her salvation, a guide through the whiteout that prevented her from wandering off course. Daniel collapsed 3 times his expensive Italian dress shoes, providing zero traction on ice-crusted snow. Each time, Claire had to physically haul his dead weight back to his feet, her muscles tearing with the effort, her lungs burning from exertion. In air, so cold it felt like inhaling razor blades. Amber moved mechanically, following Claire's back like a sleepwalker, her eyes vacant. The final 20 yards were a nightmare. The slope steepened, the snow deepened, and Claire had to drag both of them, one hand on the rope, the other gripping whatever clothing she could reach. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel. Her hands lost all feeling. She moved on pure will, refusing to acknowledge the screaming protest from every muscle. Then suddenly the cave entrance was there, the plywood door. A darker rectangle in the wall of white. Claire shoved them both through the opening. Amber first, then Daniel, who stumbled and fell to his hands and knees on the earthen floor. She followed them inside and pulled the door shut against the raging storm, throwing the ladder latch with hands that shook so badly she could barely grip it. The sudden silence was staggering. Outside, the wind continued its assault, a continuous roar. Inside, the only sounds were ragged breathing and the soft crackle of the fire that had somehow kept burning during her absence. Amber collapsed immediately onto the compacted dirt floor, curling into a fetal position. Her body racked with violent shivering, the 55-degree warmth of the cave hit her freezing skin. The contrast between outside and inside was so extreme that the relative warmth actually hurt, triggering the painful sensation of thawing tissue. Daniel remained on his hands and knees, staring at the cave's interior with an expression of complete incomprehension. His eyes moved from the smooth clay walls to the meticulously notched log supports, to the Dakota fire hole burning efficiently in its carefully engineered pit. He looked at Claire, and something in his face crumbled, some core assumption about reality shattering. Claire did not move to help them further. She walked to her sleeping area, retrieved a moth-eaten wool blanket she'd found at the dump, and tossed it at Amber without ceremony. Her voice when she spoke was devoid of warmth or empathy. She was not a host welcoming guests. She was a warden acknowledging prisoners. Take off your wet coats immediately. Both of you. Your clothes are conducting cold into your core. Remove them or die. She pointed toward the far wall of the cave, away from the direct heat of the fire. Keep your bare hands away from the direct flame, Daniel. Your tissues are partially frozen. If you warm them too fast, you'll trigger chilblains and permanent nerve damage. Let the ambient air warm you slowly. For the next 72 hours, 3 human beings existed in a suffocating, intensely tense purgatory beneath the earth, while the blizzard raged without mercy above them. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it seemed to intensify, the roar becoming so continuous and overwhelming that it merged into a kind of silence white noise so constant it became almost ignorable. Inside the cave, a different kind of storm played out in frozen looks and unspoken accusations. Daniel, stripped of his ruthless attorneys and corporate wealth and towering arrogance, was reduced to a shivering, humbled shell of the man who had stood in the foyer of their Jackson Hole mansion and watched through frosted glass as she was cast out. He sat against the clay wall, wrapped in spare clothing Claire had grudgingly provided, and watched her with eyes that seemed unable to process what they were seeing. She moved through the space with complete confidence, managing the fire's oxygen intake with practiced precision, rationing their meager water supply, maintaining the structural integrity of the shelter. Every action was competent, measured, and spoke of hard-won expertise. She had built this place with her own hands, and it showed in every detail. Amber refused to make eye contact with Claire, curling into a tight ball in the corner farthest from the fire, wrapped in the thin blanket and her own shame. She had stopped crying after the first day, but her face remained a mask of misery. Occasionally, she would glance at Daniel, and Claire could read the dawning horror in those glances. The younger woman was beginning to understand exactly what kind of man she had chosen. Claire rationed food with iron discipline. She had 1 jar of peanut butter, 1 box of crackers, and 3 cans of soup to sustain 3 people for an unknown duration. She divided everything into portions so small they mocked the concept of a meal: a spoonful of peanut butter, 3 crackers, half a cup of soup. No one complained. Hunger was a luxury problem compared to freezing to death. The psychological dynamics were impossible to ignore. Daniel watched Claire perform tasks that should have been impossible for someone without resources or training. She maintained their fire with wood she had cut and carried herself. She melted snow in containers she had scavenged from a dump. She had engineered ventilation that prevented carbon monoxide poisoning while keeping them warm. She had done all of this while he had assumed she would simply die. The realization of what she had accomplished and what it said about his fundamental misjudgment of who she was seemed to erode something essential in him. Claire saw it happening and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, just a cold recognition that the man she had loved no longer existed and perhaps never had. On what she believed was the second night underground, Amber finally broke her silence. Her voice emerged small and uncertain, directed at no one in particular. "I didn't know about the water, about any of it." Claire was feeding a log into the fire and didn't pause in her work. She didn't respond, didn't acknowledge the comment, simply continued her task with mechanical efficiency. Amber tried again, desperation creeping into her tone. "He told me you had cheated, that you were trying to destroy his company. I thought, I thought I was helping him rebuild his life." Claire finished adjusting the fire, then sat back on her pine bough bed. She looked at Amber directly for the first time since dragging her into the cave. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but absolute. "You were stupid, but you didn't steal from me. He did." The words hung in the still air. Daniel flinched as if struck, but said nothing. What could he say? The evidence of his theft was all around them. Claire surviving in a dwelling she had built from nothing after he had tried to leave her with less than nothing. The third night brought the question Claire had been expecting. Daniel's voice emerged from the shadows where he sat, hoarse from disuse in the dry air. "Why did you do it?" Claire didn't pretend to misunderstand. She knew what he was asking. Why had she saved them when letting them die would have been easier, cleaner, and arguably justified? She looked at him across the firelight, seeing a man she had once loved, now reduced to exactly what he deserved to be: desperate, dependent, and utterly without power. Her response was simple, each word chosen with care. "Because I'm not a monster, Daniel." She paused, letting that sink in, then continued, "And more importantly, because I need you breathing." His brow furrowed in confusion, the question obvious in his expression. She smiled, then a small, cold expression that held no warmth. "To watch me take absolutely everything back." The words settled into the space between them like a prophecy delivered and accepted. Daniel's face went carefully blank, but Claire saw understanding dawn behind his eyes. He had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had assumed her destruction was complete, permanent, irreversible. Instead, he had forged something harder than the woman he'd discarded. He had created an enemy who now held his life in her hands and had chosen to preserve it only so he could witness his own ruin. The blizzard finally broke on the morning of the fifth day. Claire woke to a sound that her exhausted mind initially couldn't process: silence. The continuous roar that had been her constant companion for nearly a week had simply stopped. She lay in her sleeping bag for a moment disoriented before realizing what the absence meant. She climbed carefully to her feet, muscles stiff from days of minimal movement, and approached the door. Opening it slowly, she was hit by a wall of blindingly bright sunlight reflecting off pristine snow. The world outside had been transformed into an alien landscape of white drifts and crystalline beauty that was almost painful to look at. The snow had accumulated to depths that defied easy measurement. Drifts reached 8 feet in places, sculpted by wind into smooth alien shapes. The temperature had risen to perhaps 10 degrees Fahrenheit, positively balmy compared to the -30 conditions during the storm's peak. In the distance, Claire could hear the deep mechanical rumble of heavy equipment. The county snowplow crews were out systematically clearing Highway 191 and checking the graveyard of abandoned vehicles that littered the route. She turned back to her unwilling guests. "It's over. The storm has passed. Get your coats." Daniel and Amber moved with the slow, uncertain motions of people who had spent days in a small space with minimal food. They pulled on their expensive, inadequate coats, now dried by the fire, but still useless against serious cold. Claire led them outside, following a path she carved through chest-deep snow toward where the highway lay buried. The trek to the road took 40 minutes of brutal work. Claire broke trail, her body remembering the motions from her scavenging trips, while Daniel and Amber followed in her wake. By the time they reached Highway 191, all three were exhausted, but the road itself had been cleared, a dark ribbon of asphalt carved through walls of plowed snow. A Sublette County Sheriff's Department vehicle was parked near where the Range Rover had crashed, half buried and invisible beneath snow. Deputy Sheriff Wyatt Peterson stood beside an ambulance talking to paramedic Brenda Higgins. They were systematically checking abandoned vehicles, searching for survivors or bodies. When Brenda saw 3 people emerge from what appeared to be a hole in the hillside, alive, coherent, and intact despite a storm that had already claimed 14 lives across Wyoming, she actually dropped the medical kit she was holding. Her voice carried shock that bordered on disbelief. Where did you? Claire gestured back toward her property. "I built a shelter. These 2 crashed near my land. I brought them in." Wyatt Peterson's eyes moved from Claire to Daniel to Amber, processing what that simple statement meant. He understood survival in this country, understood what it took to live through conditions that had killed more than a dozen people. His expression shifted to something approaching respect. "Ma'am, you saved their lives. That storm killed 14 people statewide, another 40 hospitalized for severe frostbite and hypothermia." Claire simply nodded. She felt no pride, no satisfaction. She had done what needed doing, nothing more. Brenda moved forward with her medical equipment, checking vital signs, looking for signs of frostbite or dangerous hypothermia. Both Daniel and Amber were stable, though showing signs of malnutrition and mild cold exposure. As the paramedics loaded them into the ambulance for transport to Pinedale Hospital for observation, Daniel looked back at Claire one last time. She met his gaze steadily, her expression unreadable. Then the ambulance doors closed and they were gone. Wyatt approached Claire as the vehicle pulled away, its lights flashing, but no siren necessary on empty roads. "That your shelter back there?" Claire nodded. "You build that yourself." Another nod. Wyatt was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the assessment of someone who'd spent decades in law enforcement reading people. "You need anything, ride into town." "Medical attention." Claire shook her head, exhaustion suddenly hitting her like a physical one. "I just need to go home." She walked back through the snow to her cave, pulled the plywood door closed behind her, and allowed herself to collapse onto her sleeping area. She had survived. Against impossible odds, with no resources and no help, she had not only kept herself alive but had preserved the lives of the 2 people who had tried to destroy her. The victory was cold and absolute, and it was only the beginning. The aftermath of the blizzard moved with a swiftness that surprised even Claire. She did not waste time recovering or celebrating survival. On Monday morning, exactly 3 days after the storm broke, She drove her battered Subaru the 200 miles to Cheyenne, the engine burning oil and trailing smoke, but somehow maintaining enough function to complete the journey. Margaret Hastings maintained an office in a converted Victorian mansion in downtown Cheyenne, the kind of location that announced success without vulgarity. Her reputation as a corporate litigator specialized in high-stakes fraud preceded her through every courthouse in Wyoming. She had built her career destroying people who thought they were too clever to be caught, and her success rate was extraordinary enough to command fees that would have been impossible for Claire to afford under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances, and Margaret Hastings had a particular interest in cases involving systematic financial abuse disguised as legitimate business. She agreed to meet Claire on contingency, taking 40% of whatever recovery she achieved. It was a gamble on Margaret's part, betting her time and expertise against the possibility of a substantial payout. Claire walked into the initial consultation carrying a cardboard box containing everything she had managed to preserve. Arthur's Field notebook documenting the aquifer discovery, the Delaware Shell Corporation papers she had signed without reading, bank statements showing the systematic depletion of joint accounts, the eviction notice, and a detailed written timeline of events compiled during the long hours underground when she'd had nothing to do except think. Margaret was in her late 50s, silver hair cut in a precise bob, wearing a suit that managed to project authority without ostentation. She listened to Claire's summary without interruption, taking notes in handwriting so neat it looked printed. When Claire finished, Margaret sat back in her chair and studied her potential client with eyes that missed nothing. You understand that if we pursue this, we're not just overturning a divorce settlement. We're alleging federal crimes, wire fraud, perjury, potentially RICO violations if we can establish conspiracy. Your ex-husband will fight with everything he has because he's facing prison time. Claire met her gaze without flinching. I understand. Margaret smiled, then a small expression that held genuine appreciation. Good, because I'm going to need you to be harder than anything he can throw at us. Can you do that? Claire thought about 2 weeks spent digging frozen earth with a mattock, about surviving conditions that had killed 14 people, about pulling the man who destroyed her life out of a blizzard and keeping him alive solely so he could witness his own ruin. I can do that. Margaret opened a legal pad and began writing. Let's start with what we can prove. The investigation that followed was methodical, surgical, and absolutely devastating. Margaret hired a forensic accountant named Robert Williams, who specialized in tracing hidden assets and reconstructing financial crimes. She retained a private investigator to document Daniel's movements and associations. She filed emergency discovery motions that forced Daniel's attorney, Harrison Cross, to produce documents under penalty of contempt. Within 2 weeks, the structure of Daniel's deception began to emerge with crystalline clarity. 6 months before filing for divorce, Daniel had commissioned a private geological survey of Arthur Whitmore's property through a consultant firm based in Denver. The survey had cost $45,000 and concluded that the land sat atop a commercially viable aquifer with an estimated value of $3.2 million for water rights alone. The survey was never disclosed in mandatory asset declarations during divorce proceedings. This omission, made under penalty of perjury, constituted a felony. The Delaware Shell Corporation that suddenly owned Claire's house and Daniel's business had been created in the same month the geological survey was completed. The corporate documents showed Daniel as the sole beneficial owner, with Claire listed as having zero equity, despite 12 years of capital contributions that her bank records clearly documented. The timing was damning. The Shell Corporation was established. The geological survey was completed. Then Daniel initiated the affair with Amber Fletcher, knowing Claire would demand a divorce when she discovered it. The eviction notice had been prepared weeks in advance, filed the moment Claire left for Denver to attend her dying mother. It was premeditated destruction executed with cold precision. Harrison Cross, faced with evidence of his own participation in filing fraudulent court documents, made a choice that destroyed whatever professional relationship he'd had with Daniel. In exchange for immunity from prosecution and retention of his law license, Harrison agreed to testify as a state's witness. His deposition, conducted in a conference room in Cheyenne with a court reporter documenting every word, was 43 pages of detailed confession. Harrison confirmed that Daniel had shown him the geological survey and explicitly instructed him to omit it from asset disclosures. He confirmed that the Delaware Corporation was designed specifically to hide marital assets. He confirmed that the eviction was timed to coincide with Claire's absence, maximizing her vulnerability. He confirmed everything. Margaret filed a motion to vacate the original divorce settlement on grounds of fraud, accompanied by a separate criminal referral to the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Wyoming. The referral outlined wire fraud charges based on interstate communications related to the conspiracy and perjury charges based on false statements made in federal court filings. The machinery of federal prosecution ground forward with implacable momentum. An assistant U.S. attorney named Patricia Reynolds reviewed the evidence Margaret had compiled and concluded that the case was prosecutable and winnable. She convened a grand jury which returned indictments against Daniel Brennan on 3 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of perjury. Daniel's legal defense team initially attempted to fight. They filed motions to dismiss, arguing that asset disputes in divorce proceedings were civil matters, not criminal ones. They argued that the geological survey had been commissioned for legitimate business purposes unrelated to the divorce. They argued that the omission from asset disclosures had been an oversight, not intentional fraud. Every argument failed. The documentary evidence was overwhelming, and Harrison Cross's testimony provided insider confirmation of criminal intent. By early January, 6 weeks after the blizzard, Daniel's attorneys were privately advising him to consider a plea agreement. The deposition took place on January 15th in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the federal courthouse in Cheyenne. It was the first time Claire had seen Daniel since pulling him from the snowbank, and the transformation was startling. He had lost weight, his expensive suit now hanging loose on a frame that seemed diminished. His face showed stress and deep lines around his mouth and eyes. He looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Margaret conducted the examination with surgical precision, each question designed to eliminate escape routes. Claire sat beside her, silent, watching the man she had once loved squirm under examination. Mr. Brennan, did you commission a geological survey of property located at Highway 191 Sublette County in May of last year? Daniel's attorney, a different lawyer than Harrison Cross, leaned forward and whispered something. Daniel nodded reluctantly. Yes. What was the purpose of that survey? Another whispered consultation with his attorney to assess the commercial value of the property. Did that survey identify a commercially viable aquifer beneath the property? A longer pause. Daniel's hands resting on the table clenched into fists. Yes. What was the estimated value of water rights associated with that aquifer? The survey estimated $3.2 million. Margaret made a note on her legal pad with deliberate slowness, letting the silence extend. Mr. Brennan, did you disclose the existence of this survey or its findings in your mandatory asset disclosures during divorce proceedings? The room seemed to contract. Even the court reporter's fingers paused above her stenotype machine. Daniel looked at his attorney, who gave a small, defeated nod. There was no point lying under oath when the documentary evidence was irrefutable. No, I did not disclose it. Were you aware that failing to disclose marital assets in divorce proceedings constitutes perjury? Daniel's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. I was desperate. I had made poor business decisions. I was trying to fix it. The aquifer was supposed to solve everything. It was the first crack in his armor, the first admission of motive beyond simple greed. Margaret seized on it immediately. What kind of business decisions? Risky investments, expansion loans I couldn't service. I was trying to keep the company afloat by stealing your wife's inheritance. Daniel flinched at the word stealing, but didn't contradict it. His silence was answer enough. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on an edge that made Claire's spine straighten. Mr. Brennan, your wife was visiting her dying mother in Denver when you filed eviction papers. You froze her bank accounts. You left her with $84 in a 20-year-old vehicle in October, knowing Wyoming winter temperatures would drop below zero. Did you consider what would happen to her? Daniel finally looked at Claire, then really looked at her for the first time since the deposition began. Whatever he saw on her face made him look away quickly. I thought she would sell the land, take the money, start over somewhere else. Claire's voice emerged without her consciously deciding to speak, cutting through the formal procedure with the weight of lived experience. You thought I would die, Daniel. You counted on it. The room went absolutely silent. The court reporter's hands hovered above her machine. Margaret didn't interrupt, sensing that this moment needed to happen. Daniel opened his mouth closed, it opened it again. No words emerged that could adequately respond to the accusation. Because it was true and everyone in the room knew it. He had orchestrated circumstances designed to leave her no options except capitulation or death, and he had been confident she would choose capitulation. Margaret broke the silence, her voice professionally neutral, but carrying satisfaction beneath the surface. Mr. Brennan, I think we're done here. The plea negotiations proceeded with brutal efficiency. The federal prosecutor's office, armed with overwhelming evidence and a cooperating witness, had no incentive to offer generous terms. They proposed a deal Daniel would plead guilty to 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of perjury in exchange for dismissal of remaining charges. Sentencing guidelines recommended 48 to 60 months in federal prison, with the final term at the judge's discretion. The alternative was going to trial where conviction was virtually certain and would result in maximum sentences on all counts, potentially 15 years. Daniel's legal team advised him to take the deal. The civil proceedings moved in parallel. Margaret filed an amended complaint seeking to void the entire divorce settlement return and all marital assets to joint ownership and award Claire punitive damages for intentional infliction of emotional distress. She also filed for full ownership of Brennan Freight and Supply as compensation for Claire's 12 years of uncompensated labor and capital investment. Daniel's assets were frozen pending resolution of the civil claims. The Jackson Hole mansion was placed under court supervision. The business was assigned a temporary receiver. His bank accounts were locked. Within 3 weeks of Margaret filing her motions, Daniel Brennan was effectively bankrupt, living on credit extended by his attorney and whatever family members were still willing to help. The federal sentencing hearing took place on a cold morning in late January. Judge Patricia Wilson presided, a woman in her early 60s with a reputation for running an efficient courtroom and showing limited patience for white-collar criminals who acted like their wealth entitled them to special consideration. The courtroom was surprisingly full. Cases involving federal fraud charges attracted legal observers, and this one had generated local media attention because of the unusual circumstances: the wife left to die in a blizzard, the hidden aquifer, the dramatic rescue that preserved the defendant's life only so he could face justice. Claire sat in the gallery, Margaret beside her. Daniel stood at the defense table, flanked by his attorneys wearing a dark suit that looked too large for him now. He had aged a decade in 2 months. Judge Wilson reviewed the plea agreement, the sentencing guidelines, and the victim impact statement Claire had submitted. Then she looked at Daniel with an expression that conveyed exactly how much sympathy he could expect. Her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Mr. Brennan, I've reviewed the extensive evidence in this case. What you did to your wife goes beyond simple fraud. You didn't just steal from her financially. You orchestrated circumstances specifically designed to endanger her life. She paused, letting that assessment settle. During the harshest winter in 4 decades, you left her with less than $100 and no shelter, knowing that Wyoming temperatures would drop to lethal levels. You did this deliberately as part of a calculated plan to force her to sell property you knew was worth millions for a tiny fraction of its value. Daniel stood rigidly, his face carefully blank, but Claire could see his jaw clenching. That she survived is a testament to her strength, ingenuity, and determination. It reflects no mercy from you. In fact, the record shows that when she was dying in a blizzard you were warned about, you were attempting to file preliminary water rights paperwork to steal what you had already stolen. Judge Wilson consulted her notes briefly. The federal sentencing guidelines recommend 48 to 60 months imprisonment. The prosecution has agreed to this range as part of your plea agreement. However, this court finds that the aggravating factors in this case warrant a sentence at the maximum end of that range. She looked directly at Daniel. You are sentenced to 48 months in federal custody to be served at a facility determined by the Bureau of Prisons, no early release, full restitution as determined by the civil proceedings. Is there anything you wish to say? Daniel's attorney leaned over and whispered something, probably advising silence. But Daniel shook his head and stepped forward slightly. I want to apologize to Claire. I made terrible choices. I was desperate, and I convinced myself that what I was doing was somehow justified. It wasn't. I'm sorry. The apology hung in the air, inadequate and too late. Claire felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, no sense of closure. Just a cold recognition that words meant nothing when measured against actions. Judge Wilson's expression suggested she shared that assessment. Your apology is noted. It does not alter this court's sentence. 48 months full restitution, no early release. Bailiff remand the defendant into custody. Two U.S. Marshals stepped forward. Daniel was handcuffed, a procedure that seemed to drain the last of his composure. He looked back at Claire one final time as they led him toward the door. She met his gaze steadily, her expression revealing nothing. Then he was gone. And the chapter of her life that had included Daniel Brennan was finally irrevocably closed. The civil settlement was finalized 3 weeks later in a conference room rather than a courtroom, both sides having agreed to resolve the matter without further litigation. Claire's attorney and Daniel's attorney, a new one hired specifically for the civil case, negotiated terms while Claire sat in silence. The original divorce settlement was vacated entirely. The Jackson Hole mansion reverted to joint ownership, then was awarded to Claire as her separate property. Brennan Freight and Supply was restructured, with Claire receiving 70% ownership and operational control. The remaining 30% was placed in a trust to satisfy Daniel's creditors and fund his restitution obligations. Full unencumbered rights to the Pinedale Aquifer were confirmed as Claire's separate property inherited from Arthur Whitmore and never legitimately part of marital assets. David Kensington's Water Rights Consortium, after consultation with their attorneys, withdrew any claim and publicly apologized for their attempted coercion. Daniel was left with nothing. The federal prison system did not distinguish between bankrupt fraudsters and affluent ones. He would serve his sentence in the same conditions as anyone else convicted of wire fraud, and when he emerged in 4 years, he would be a felon with no assets, no business, and a reputation that ensured no legitimate company would hire him. Claire walked out of the settlement conference and stood on the steps of the office building, breathing cold Wyoming air, feeling the weight of complete victory settle on her shoulders. It should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt hollow, like she'd won a war where the prize was discovering she no longer wanted what she'd been fighting for. Margaret joined her on the steps, carrying a briefcase full of signed documents that represented the legal resurrection of Claire's life. You should feel good. This is total victory. Most people in your situation would be lucky to recover a fraction of what was stolen. Claire nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Margaret studied her face with the perceptiveness that made her such an effective attorney. But it doesn't fix what was broken, does it? The betrayal, the time lost, the person you were before all this. No, it doesn't fix any of that. Margaret placed a hand briefly on Claire's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity from one woman to another. Then decide what you're going to build instead. You survived the worst Wyoming winter in 40 years by digging a home into a mountain with your bare hands. Whatever you build next, it won't be limited by what Daniel took. It will be defined by what you're capable of creating. The words settled into Claire's consciousness like seeds planted in fertile ground. She wasn't the woman who had stood outside that locked mansion in October. That woman had been destroyed completely and irrevocably. The question was who she would become instead. Claire drove back to Pinedale that afternoon, the Subaru somehow still running, despite burning oil and making concerning noises from the transmission. She pulled onto her property as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of that first desperate evening when she'd arrived with nothing. The cave entrance was still there, the plywood door weathered but functional. She pulled it open and stepped inside, surprised to find that the interior still held residual warmth from the fire she'd allowed to burn down before leaving for Cheyenne. The earthen walls, the log supports, the Dakota fire hole, all of it exactly as she'd left it. She had built this place to survive. Now she had resources to build something meant for living. Over the next 3 months, Claire transformed her relationship with the land her grandfather had left her. She sold the Jackson Hole mansion for $2.8 million, refusing to set foot inside it again. The money went into an account she controlled exclusively, and she used a portion of it to hire an architectural firm specializing in sustainable earth-sheltered design. The new structure would be built into the mountain, incorporating the original cave as a historical memorial and storage area, but expanding into something designed for permanent habitation. The plans called for 2,200 square feet of living space built into the natural slope with a south-facing wall of glass to capture passive solar heat. A green roof of native grasses would blend the structure into the landscape. Geothermal heating drawn from the same aquifer her grandfather had discovered would provide efficient temperature control year-round. The project took 6 months to complete, construction crews working through spring and early summer. Claire supervised at every detail, catching errors in the plans, suggesting modifications based on her intimate knowledge of the site, ensuring that the finished structure honored both the mountain and her grandfather's memory. Thomas Griggs visited during construction, bringing with him a gift wrapped in old newspaper. Inside was Arthur Whitmore's surveying transit, a precision instrument from the 1960s that Thomas had kept in the back room of his hardware store for 40 years. His voice carried the satisfaction of a man fulfilling a long-held obligation. Your grandfather left this with me back in '88, right before he got sick. Said he wanted you to have it someday when you were old enough to understand what it meant. I guess now's that time. Claire accepted the transit with hands that trembled slightly. This tangible connection to the man who had seen something in her that she hadn't seen in herself. He knew I'd need this land. Thomas shrugged his weathered face, thoughtful. Arthur was a smart man, real smart. He understood rocks and earth and water better than anyone I ever met. But he also understood people. I think he knew you'd figure out what to do when the time came. That evening, Claire examined the transit, carefully running her fingers over its brass fittings and carefully calibrated sights. Tucked into the wooden case protected by oiled cloth, she found a single piece of paper she'd somehow missed during her earlier examination. It was a handwritten letter dated March 1988, 2 months before Arthur died. The handwriting was shaky illness already affecting his motor control, but the words were clear. Claire, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Doctor says lung cancer, 6 months if I'm lucky. Didn't find gold like I hoped when I bought this land. Found something better. Water. Life. I'm leaving this property to you because I know what Daniel is. Your mother mentioned him once, showed me a photo. Didn't like his eyes. Too calculating, like he's always measuring what things are worth instead of what they mean. He'll never understand land like this. He'll see dollar signs where there's actually home. You're different. You see structures, patterns, how things fit together. You'll know what to do. Trust the limestone. It remembers everything. The mountain will take care of you if you let it. Arthur. Claire read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face for the first time since her mother's funeral. Arthur had known. 38 years ago, he'd met Daniel, once seen a photograph, and understood with a geologist's instinct for reading strata what kind of man he was. He'd protected her the only way he could by leaving her something Daniel couldn't steal except through the elaborate fraud that had ultimately destroyed him. The aquifer negotiations took a different path than David Kensington's consortium had intended. Claire refused to sell the water rights for immediate profit. Instead, she partnered with the Pinedale Municipal Water Authority to create a long-term supply agreement. The town needed clean water for a growing population. The aquifer could provide it without commercial exploitation that would drain the resource dry. The contract ran for 10 years, guaranteed $4 million in total revenue, and included strict conservation protocols to ensure the aquifer remained viable for future generations. It wasn't the maximum profit she could have extracted, but it was sustainable, responsible, and honored Arthur's vision of water as life rather than commodity. By October, exactly 1 year after Daniel had changed the locks and destroyed her life, Claire Whitmore stood on the reinforced balcony of her new home, looking out over the Wyoming Valley as autumn colors painted the landscape. The structure behind her was an architectural achievement featured in design magazines and nominated for sustainability awards. But more importantly, it was home. The original cave was preserved as Arthur had left it, accessible through a door in the basement level. Claire visited it sometimes, sitting in the space where she had survived the worst winter of her life, remembering the woman who had dug frozen earth with a mattock and refused to surrender. That woman was gone now, transformed by fire and ice and absolute necessity into someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more capable. The betrayal that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning, stripping away everything soft and unnecessary until only the essential core remained. She thought about Daniel sometimes serving his sentence in a federal facility somewhere, his comfortable life reduced to a cell and a number. She felt no satisfaction in his imprisonment, no sense that justice balanced the scales. What he had done to her couldn't be undone by his suffering, but it could be transcended by her success, and that was a victory worth claiming. A week later, Claire received an unexpected letter forwarded from her attorney's office. The return address was a federal correctional institution in Colorado. She opened it carefully, half expecting some attempt at manipulation or continued abuse. Instead, she found a single page written in Daniel's handwriting, notably degraded from the elegant script she remembered. Claire, I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect forgiveness or even acknowledgement. But my counselor here says I need to take accountability, and writing this is part of that process. You were right about everything. I did count on you dying, or at least being desperate enough that you'd accept whatever I offered. I told myself I was solving a problem, that the money would fix everything, that you'd be fine because you were smart and capable. But the truth is, I didn't care whether you'd be fine. I cared about getting what I wanted, and I was willing to destroy you to get it. The blizzard should have killed me. You could have left me in that car and no one would have blamed you. Instead, you saved my life, and I finally understood what you'd been trying to tell me all along. Being smart doesn't make you good. Being successful doesn't make you worthy. I spent 12 years married to someone better than me and never appreciated what that meant. I'm sorry, not because it helps you, but because it's true. I hope you built something beautiful on that land. I hope the mountain gave you what I never could, Daniel. Claire read the letter once, then walked to the fireplace and dropped it into the flames. She watched the paper curl and blacken Daniel's words, transforming into ash and smoke. There was nothing in that letter she needed. No apology could restore what he'd taken. No acknowledgement could repair the damage. But she had built something beautiful. She had taken the worst betrayal in the coldest winter and transformed them into a home carved from the living earth. She had learned that strength wasn't something you possessed. It was something you became when every other option was stripped away. A month later, construction began on a community center in downtown Pinedale, funded by a portion of Claire's aquifer revenue. The building would house a women's shelter, legal aid services, and educational programs for financial literacy and legal rights in marriage. Claire designed it herself, incorporating passive solar design and earth sheltering techniques she'd learned through necessity. On the day the foundation was poured, Thomas Griggs stopped by the construction site. He stood beside Claire, watching concrete flow into forms, and nodded his approval. Arthur would be proud, not just of what you built, but of why you built it. Claire thought about that, about her grandfather quietly preparing for her future decades before she needed it, about the mountain that had sheltered her when everything else failed, about the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become. Her response emerged quiet but absolute, a truth she had earned through blood and ice and unbreakable will. The mountain doesn't give you what you need. It shows you what you are capable of surviving, and then it makes you prove it. Spring came early that year, melting snow, revealing land that remembered everything, every swing of the mattock, every log hauled from the forest, every desperate calculation of whether she had enough fuel to survive another night. The earth held those memories in its strata, like Arthur had promised, permanent and unchanging. Claire Whitmore stood on her balcony watching the valley transform from white to green, and understood finally that Daniel hadn't destroyed her life that October day. He had simply removed the comfortable illusion that security came from anything except yourself. The mountain had taught her the rest, that survival was a choice you made every day.